Hello, and welcome back to Word of Mouth. Now, we've just hit Memorial Day, and it's a lovely time of year. That wonderful time of year that's so uniquely American to have such things as summer road trips and summer trips down to the other uniquely American experience, the theme park. For this month's adult story time, and as a reminder, Word of Mouth is an adult story time. Children, you may want to be out of the room for this one. Let us experience a hypothetical scenario. Let's say hypothetically in that wonderful little land we call Florida, just our neighbor just a little to the south, that there was, say, another theme park, perhaps something like, but not exactly like the two that we have in our world. Let us think for a moment about how wonderful some fantastic lands are down there. And now let's think about situations where things could and will go wrong. For Word of Mouth this month, we're taking a little trip to FantasticLand. And we're going to do a little something different as well. Instead of me starting off with chapter 1 and going on to 2, etc., this book is styled a little differently. So we're going to start with author's notes before we go on to our first interviews. Because this story is told in, well, you'll figure it out. Author's notes. By now, the details of what happened in FantasticLand during the 35 days dubbed the Battle of the Tribes have been dissected, obsessed over, satirized so thoroughly by the public and the media that returning to what we know to have happened seems simultaneously a waste of time and a refreshing new take on the story. The sheer number of images and stories that defy belief, and with the story occupying so dominant a place in the public consciousness, I feel it vital to exercise a little bit of work to establish the facts. In the simplest terms that I can, here's what happened. On September 15th, 2017, a hurricane more powerful than any in history fully broadsided the eastern coast of Florida. The effects of the hurricane, dubbed Hurricane Sadie, were felt along the totality of the Florida shoreline. The wind, subsequent flooding, destroyed power grids, battered inland businesses, and left hundreds of thousands of homes gone. Local authorities were instantly outmatched. The National Guard were dispatched, but they were in over their heads. The Red Cross could only help so much, and by November 1st, thousands of people had died, not of drowning or distant and direct effects of the storm, but of neglect, exposure, and lack of fresh water. Some smaller communities were not contacted until almost a month after the storm, in most cases far too late to do any good. Before the FantasticLand story broke, the phrase America's shame had been attached to response efforts and was gaining traction. It was only when the situation came under a reasonable amount of control and billions of federal government aid had been distributed that the story of FantasticLand hit with a crash that shattered all other news about the stories of the disaster. It sounded like an urban legend at first. Far too out there to be real. Only after the ruins of the once mighty amusement park appeared in online footage did it become clear the worst stories were true. Shockingly true. Unbelievably true. But undeniable as well. Of the 326 employees who stayed behind in the park, 207 were eventually evacuated. The fate of the 119 missing souls may never be known, but evidence of death and slaughter was immediately apparent. Photos soon emerged, heads on spikes outside of rives, corpses floating in detention cells, and viscera decaying in the humid Florida sun. FantasticLand, where fun is guaranteed, was covered in blood. There were human bones littering the gift shops. It was all the country could talk about. The coverage crossed all media, breaking records for hits, views, likes, clicks, and shares. The most indelible image, the one most of the public saw first, is among the most haunting photos of the past 50 years, snapped on a cell phone camera by Sergeant Richard Hamill of the Florida State Patrol, who was among the first 30 members of law enforcement through the gates after the site was cleared by the National Guard. The photo shows the 75-foot-tall FantasticLand logo, a bright red exclamation point, at the center of the 2,200-acre amusement park, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces on the ground. In its place, a crude yardum stretched between the support towers that once held the exclamation point in place. Hanging from the plank and 5 bodies strung by their necks. 2 nooses are empty, the bodies fully visible on the ground. One has simply fallen, the other has been decapitated, but behind the bodies, a sign boasts in bright letters, "Fun is guaranteed." Reinforcements were called immediately. By the time employees broke their silence and began telling the stories, the media was scrambling and desperate to get on the scene. Unfortunately for Fantastic Fun Inc., the legal owners of the park, an uploaded video showed National Guard troops entering the park the very day a press conference downplaying the carnage was held. The footage aired side by side on most networks. Details began to emerge, bringing with them a flood of unanswerable, terrible questions. How could a group of survivors, mostly children, commit such terrible acts? How could survivors, with the best possible circumstances in which to weather the storm and its aftermath, produce the worst possible results? What does this say about our youth, ourselves? Is every American teenager just a few short steps away from bloodthirsty savagery? How do we prevent this in the future? That was an American institution that had provided the joy to children since the 1970s and fatally harmed by the incident? Or is it possible to redeem this organization? Many of these questions are answered in the following interviews, but I will warn you, many questions remain, and the answers I found only led to more questions. I was able to speak with almost all of the key players, from Fantastic Inc. representatives to evacuated employees and rescue crews, and as you've probably heard in the publicity running up to the release of this book, there are multiple interviews with employees inside the park, as well as interviews of 5 of the 7 members of the infamous Council of Pieces. If there are answers, these are the people who would have them. Yet as I turned this book over to my editor, I felt I understood the events either only as well or slightly less well than I did after the initial news articles had been written and all the trials had been set. I knew facts, I knew locations, I knew the players. I looked into their eyes. With one notable exception, none of these, some very young adults, are monsters. With one notable exception. I'm convinced of that. I know now what I suspected then, that a cocktail of immense fear, absolute freedom, rising uncertainty, boredom, raging hormones, and the like turned an amusement park into a tribal battleground. I've read dozens of think pieces that have dissected every aspect of the story, from academics giving their thoughtful criticism to take away their phone, they turn kids to killers, hysteria, and paranoia. I've heard the players describe what they were thinking, and I still can't answer the most awful question everyone asks themselves. What would I have done? What if I were scared 20-something, just getting my feet under me, more concerned with my Instagram account than my 401k? What if I had the entirety of human knowledge and the experience of it all at my fingertips and were suddenly plunged back into the dark age? What if I were cold and wet and scared and sick and bored to the point of losing my mind? Would I have followed someone? What if someone asked me to kill? Most of us want to believe that we would have acted more reasonably if trapped in Fantastic Land. We would like to believe that you would have hidden or would have climbed away or calmed things down, or you would have found some non-violent way to ride out the events that led to so many dead bodies. On some level, we all think that about ourselves. So allow me to share one story before we divide and dive into the interviews. There are many reasons I was unable to interview 19-year-old Alice Barlow, who, my sources tell me, was an archer for the Shop Girls tribe, one of 7 tribes that formed out of the time Fantastic Land was cut off from humanity. There were only 4 archers in the entire park, 2 of whom were shop girls. Of the 92 bodies recovered, and incredibly 34 were killed by arrows. It is possible, albeit unlikely, that Alice didn't fire any of the killing shots. More likely that there were moments perched on rooftops of confectionaries and clothing stores and year-round Christmas shops when Alice shot arrow after arrow after arrow into the head, neck, chest, and legs of her co-workers as they bled and scrambled and died below. It's not a stretch to speculate that it became somewhat normal for her, as she was rewarded every time she spilled blood. Alice was a good student, 3.7 GPA in high school, and had a promising future in veterinary medicine. Beyond that, her digital trail paints the story of the all-American sweetheart. She loved movies, music, but her Facebook page, now deleted, had over 200 photos of her with animals. One photo shows Alice holding a baby duck gingerly as if to protect it on a stormy, windy day. If I were to interview Alice Barlow and ask her how the girl who protected a soft yellow duckling with only her hands could turn around and kill with impunity after only a few days cut off from civilization, what would I say? What could she say? I don't know that she knows the answers herself, or that we would know the answers if it were staring us in the face. It is my hope that this book not only sets the record straight on some pretty irresponsible reporting, but also that for every arrow shot and every corpse viewed, you remember Alice and Joy and Alan and Tamara and Reggie and the other human beings who were in the situation there, were in a situation most of us cannot fathom. There are many, many facts about the events of Fantastic Land found in these pages, but there are also stories of human beings who started off as something else and were sometimes led, sometimes forced, sometimes coerced into acts of unspeakable savagery. Remember the victims. Remember those who are left alive. Most of all, remember the children they used to be. Because while many of them are still children, for a few weeks, they were monsters. Most likely you would have been too. A quick note on the format of the book. I have removed my questions from the conversations, streamlined the stories, and made a few editorial tweaks and edits to keep the subject on point and their narratives flowing. In some cases, large parts of the interviews were cut for relevance or clarity, but at no point do I believe I have misinterpreted or misrepresented anything said by the subjects. In many cases, I have preserved the conversational flow by keeping transitions and other verbal tics as markers left for the ease of the reader. A few chapters are presented in their original uncut form. The original audio of the interviews are available at my website, and I encourage them to be listened to by you all. Author Adam Jakes. Last chance, folks. You heard the warning, and by the way, Mr. Jakes is not the author of this book. That's a convenient name the author took, just for clarity's sake. But let's start off with interview 1. Jessica Landis, Fantastic Land historian, author of Fun is Guaranteed, an authorized history of Fantastic Land. My daughter told me the only time she ever heard me swear was when I was watching the media coverage of the Fantastic Land situation. I told her it was the last time I remember really doing it, too, because nothing pisses off a historian more than seeing context thrown out the window because people were too lazy to ask questions. Also, if they're too stupid to know to ask those questions to provide that context in the first place, that's just as bad. Either way, when you look at it, the novelty of this whole thing is that it happened at Fantasticland, but history is the key. In order to put the whole tribes thing in any sort of context, you have to start off with Johnny Fresno and the way he did things, and to my mind, nobody in the media bothered to do that. That wasn't his real name, obviously, but a persona he created. You could tell just by looking at him and his posture that he had thought a lot of himself and his place in the world. He was a short man, but he had a strut, for lack of a better term. After talking with Johnny for a few minutes, it was clear that he had an ego, but he could back it up. He was creative, he was enthusiastic, he was fun. He was every inch the legend, never a disappointment. He was born Muhammad Assad Kassab, and he grew up several locations across the Middle East. He was privately educated, and his father moved their family around while working in the oil business. Fresno, he insisted on being called Fresno. He never told anyone exactly what his father did, and there aren't great records of the guy, but we know at least that the Kassab family was known to have lived in Egypt, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia for the first 8 years of Johnny's life, then Canada, and then finally the United States. All of his family freely admit that little Muhammad was the black sheep from the get-go. He was the youngest of four brothers, and the only one not to follow their father's footsteps into the oil business or choose to go to a career in the military. The father, Yosef, ran a very strict household and didn't like the boys to consume a lot of media. Muhammad didn't see his first move until he was 8, but well before that, it was pretty clear he was going to go different directions than the rest of his family. His mother used to call him my little dreamer, and while his father didn't know how to relate to him at all, that meant a lot of yelling and the occasional beating when Muhammad would spend his time writing or drawing instead of more masculine pursuits. So imagine the situation. You've got a strong, rich man, his sophisticated jewel of a wife, three older brothers who built themselves like tanks and who live with dedication to impressing their father. And then you had one more child in the corner playing with dolls he made out of grass and twigs. He was creative in the least fertile environment you could imagine for an artist. But what that upbringing accomplished was to make him single-minded and absolutely sure of his vision. When he lashed onto something, he didn't waver until he had it done. He obviously inherited his father's sense of pride in his work, as well as his sense of indomitability. He barely got into UCLA, he wasn't a great student, but the second he left the front stoop of his parents' home, he stopped thinking of himself in his old life and started living his life as Johnny Fresno. I asked him about it before he died. Where did that name come from? It's patently ridiculous. It's phony as a $3 bill, and I don't want to traffic in stereotypes, but he was obviously of Middle Eastern descent. His accent would come and go, and there aren't a lot of Fresnos in Jordan or Syria. When you say Johnny Fresno, I immediately conjure up some blonde surfer stereotype from North Beach. But when I posed the question to him, he answered matter-of-factly, "That's who I am." No, I met this girl in Fresno, or I thought it would appeal to Middle America. He said he was more Johnny Fresno than he was ever Muhammad Assad Kassab. In a strange way, you couldn't argue with the logic. I might be making him out to be a tortured genius type, but he was not an unpleasant guy, just the opposite. He was often described with words like generous and kind. We also don't know exactly how much of what Johnny Fresno said was, to put it diplomatically, nonsense, because the guy was first and foremost a talker. That was his skill. When you look at recent historical figures, the main challenge is to find out what they were good at. Steve Jobs, for example, was the guy who took the foreign language of technology and made it look like the future in a way everyone else could understand. But by all accounts, he was awful to work for. Fresno was the opposite. He would make you feel brilliant. His employees would take a bullet for him. But for every great idea he had a few. He had 20 terrible ideas, and if you weren't careful, he'd start insisting on implementing those bad ideas. That's where Trax came in. Trax was the CFO of Fantastic Fun Inc., one of three people in the world who could tell Johnny what was what, the others being his mother and his wife, Cassie. When Johnny Fresno said, "I want to build a giant fantasy land in the middle of New York City," Trolley, that's what everyone called him, he steered Fresno toward a cheaper land plot. When Johnny said, "I want to build in Disney World's backyard," Trolley got him to move a couple hundred miles away. When Johnny said, "I want an actual street made of gold," Ollie was the one who pointed out that it would cost more money than the GDP of most countries, and everyone would try to steal it. They eventually settled on that thin line of gold in the street that goes from the gates to the center of the park. It's all encased in plexiglass, but everyone still feels special walking the golden road. But every now and then, there was something Charlie couldn't talk Johnny Fresno out of. And this one thing is what you need to understand when you look at all those kids and what they did to each other. Johnny Fresno said he had a dream where he was in a restaurant in the clouds, where he could look one way and see nothing but trees, and another way see nothing but ocean. By now, in 1971, and Disney World had just opened and needed to make a decision about where to build that park, the media at that point was starting to speculate that two giant theme parks couldn't exist in the same state. Johnny was desperate to make sure Fantasticland stood out. It was that sort of identity to him. Then he had this dream. A month later, they broke ground on a site between Daytona Beach and the Lake George Conservation Area near Sellville. Not far from the beach, not far from the trees. A year to the day after they broke ground, Fresno was staying on top of the Point Cafe 8 stories up. There's this great video where he looks at the trees and turns and you can see the ocean way off in the distance, and he says, "It's not as good as I imagined it, but it'll do." Trax was livid about it, just livid. There were meetings where the two men threw things at each other. Trax even had to go to the hospital when John got in a particularly good shot with a glass tumbler to the temple, and Trax needed a few stitches. One secretary got so fed up with listening to them fight about where to put Fantasticland that she transcribed one of the arguments where they were screaming at each other and circulated around the offices. It soon became a pre-internet version of a meme. Author's note. Here's the transcript she's referring to. Emphasis in the original document, mind you. "If you could only see what I see," Fresno yells. Trax. "Please, listen to me, Fresno. The ocean! They have to see the ocean." Trax. "You have to see this is financially impossible." Fresno. "That's why it's a dream, Trolley. If we could build the dream, everything else would work out." Trax. "If we build this, you won't have a company, Johnny. You'll have nothing but a rusted roller coaster and soggy corn dogs." Fresno. "Oh, screw you for pissing on my dream." Trax. "Damn it, you bit me." Fresno. "Ah!" Some of the staff made t-shirts that year saying, "Screw you for pissing on my dream." My kids can't stand it when I tell that story. It kind of became the unofficial slogan for FantasticLand senior staff to this day. So I hear, but in the end, Johnny got his way. They built the thing not far from the ocean over the objections of Trax and the shareholders. Remember, this was before climate change was understood and before we knew the oceans were going to rise, so Trax knew that there would be storms because there were always storms, and that one of them would be huge and barrel through and likely do some significant damage to the park. The market bore him out on this too, because ensuring a nearly billion-dollar project a few dozen miles away from the coast was almost as bad in his mind as building a golden road at the entrance of the park. But on some things, Johnny Fresno could not be moved, and in the end, well, before all this happened, it looked like his gamble had paid off. Before all this happened, the privately held FantasticLand Inc. was worth well over $2 billion, most of which went right to Johnny Fresno. I mean, you know this as well as I do. FantasticLand is a blow for blow competitor with Disney and Universal. Each one of them does something unique. Universal has Harry Potter, Disney has, well, Disney, and FantasticLand has the immersion factor. The different FantasticLand worlds are truly different, and everyone from the planners to the snow cone salesman thinks absolutely everything about it. The food is different, the music is different. They even have to pipe in different smells for each location, like seawater for the Pipe Cove and cotton candy for the Fairy Prairie. It turns out there was not only a room for 3 theme parks, but each one would challenge the others and force them to innovate. And they would share some audiences, but I don't need to tell you about the tens of millions of people and hundreds of billions of dollars the theme park industry brings in. The difference is, of course, Universal and Disney had the good sense to build away from the ocean. Fantasticland, not so much. Part of the reason why each section of the park was so different was due to the plan that Trax put into place after that famous yelling incident. He totally shifted gears away from convincing Fresno to change his fool mind on focusing on safety and infrastructure. Instead, he ended up spending more on levies and emergency preparedness than he ever would have on insurance for a mammoth semi-coastal theme park. People thought he was too obsessive. The park was near Daytona Beach, which hadn't had a direct hit from a hurricane in 50 years. The thing is, they were absolutely right. He was obsessed. Trax brought in experts, then went to other countries and brought in their experts, and then he went and found intellectual enemies of those experts and brought them in. It reached such obsessive levels that the elaborate network of tunnels under the park doubled as bomb shelters that could withstand a 10 megaton explosion. The emergency plans were just as elaborate, some running 700 pages. I vividly remember a photo of one of those huge binders labeled Disaster Plan, the Fairy Prairie, floating in the water after the floodgates had gone away. Fresno let Trax plan and overplan and redo plans basically without limit or really supervision. Fresno told me once, it made a valued member of my team feel like he was prepared. Who was I to deny him that? See what I mean? That he could make you feel important? So these plans existed, and the park was a big success when it first opened, and little by little, the emphasis on disaster preparedness started to fade away as management changed. Then, of course, Trax died in September of 1999. Fresno died in 2001. His son Richie took over. These plans were in place, and they were also as much part of the parks as the beams that held the giant exclamation point logo to the center of town, and upper management let them be. My impression, and that's all I have, is they thought they had safety covered and didn't feel need to update or train people on what was essentially the most sophisticated disaster manual ever created by a private company. If you have something like that in your pocket, it's easy to see it as an asset as opposed to a living document that needs to be refreshed from time to time. Okay, the different worlds. As you know, Fantasticland is set up in 6 distinct areas, the first being the Golden Road, where you first enter the park. It's full of shops, info stations, topiaries, and whatnot. Then there's Fairy Prairie, which is for children 6 and under, Fantastic Future World, the World Circus, the Hero Haven, and the Pirate Cove. Then there are the many parts of the park that aren't open to the public, like the tunnels that run underneath the park for maintenance and janitorial, and multiple offices and workspaces that were hidden away beneath facades in many of these places. The offices where executives worked were divided by themed lands as well. Operations were along Golden Street, park development was in the World Circus, HR was in Fairy Prairie, which was a constant source of ridicule and bad feelings, and marketing was in Pirate Cove. The point of Trolley's disaster plan as it stood when he died was that everyone, from the janitor in the tunnel, the executive behind the facade, to the actors working the rides, would follow the same plan, and the plan happened to be one of the most comprehensive and thick and, in many ways, impenetrable documents I've ever come across. There was no easy way to look up what you were supposed to do if you had an office that was filling with water, and it never got updated. Add Ritchie's lack of focus on disaster planning, and that's a recipe for something bad to happen. When my daughter caught me screaming at the TV, that what I was screaming about was all overall the tone of the newspaper coverage. People seem to think it was some sort of metaphor that the veneer of American happiness had been stripped away, the young adults murdering each other in terrible ways was what was truly underneath. I have sworn more in this interview than I have in the past 3 months, and I promise you, but that analysis isn't pure nonsense. It just doesn't wash. Given the history I've laid out, let me give you some analysis, okay? There are three major reasons why the tribe thing happened and got so out of hand, so violent so quickly. First and foremost, these 6 parts of the park, the circus and the fairies and the pirates and all that, they all existed in very distinct geographical, technical, operational centers of the park. Pirate Cove is not like the World Circus, and it's not like the Golden Road, which is what I'm getting at. The cultures are different, the landscape's different, the tools they use are different, and the clientele is different. Hell, the smells are different. The employees, they all carried around devices, they were smartphones basically, that told them everything they needed to know for the day. And they used those to communicate with each other. And even those devices, RADs they'd call them, or RADs, were only coded to certain sections. It was like that on purpose. Johnny Fresno wanted a unique feeling for each location. He wanted the visitors to feel like they'd been to 4 or 5 parks in a day, when really they've been to one big one. He accomplished this by people working like that. Please try to hold off in your head while I consider points 2 and 3. That he wanted it like that. Point 2. I just got done telling you with each of these sections was different. The disaster guy was kind of a mess in terms of what was specific section and what was mandatory for the entire park. Parts of the disaster response were a mess inside the park. There was fresh water and food and medical supplies for everyone who was not evacuated. And there was plenty to go around. This might sound counterintuitive. If there's plenty for everyone, why'd they start fighting? They weren't starving. They had enough water, right? The way I see it, if you come up to someone and say, I'm thirsty and you have plenty of water, can I have a drink? Most people are going to be a human being and share. If it was a personal thing, if Susie from the gift shop came to you and said, please, then Susie's likely not going to be shot with an arrow or strung up in the center of the park. If everyone had enough, and they were staring across the park at 5 different groups who could potentially come and take what they had. Instead of needing to coexist to survive, the disaster plan Ollie Trax had put in place 20 years ago before bred contempt and paranoia. Basically, you had 6 little groups who felt like they were Israel, beset on all sides by those who wanted their extermination. Which brings me to the most obvious but least talked about reason why so many kids died in FantasticLand. They were kids. They were scared kids. Some of them had never been away from home more than a few weeks. These were kids that would have complained if you don't have Wi-Fi and couldn't get Facebook. What do you think happens when suddenly it's life or death? People want to make it out to be the great American failing, but try this experiment. Take 100 kids from an age group of any country, separate them on islands, give them a cocktail of strength, affirmation, and stimulation these kids were getting pumped through their brains, and 100 times out and 100 you will have bloodshed, I guarantee it. Put yourself in the shoes of any of these kids, with their peers yelling kill or be killed in their ear, coaxing them, begging them to swing that sword or shoot that arrow or just stab the other kid tied up. And I'm sorry, those images that came out of the park, I don't want to admit, but they got to me. FantasticLand was a place of dreams, and to see it disappear was bad enough, but to see the big exclamation point destroyed and the faces of the dead employees. Look, did you ever go to FantasticLand? You should have been there with a kid. See the line of gold in the street and their eyes go to that giant exclamation point, bigger than you imagined for all those weeks, and you decide where to go first. You get there, and that is better than you imagined. It's spectacular. It was awe-inspiring. Johnny Fresno was a talker and, on some level, a huckster, but he built something magnificent. That magnificent view, the rotating tower, you could see the ocean clear as day. And then you go home, and your daughter hears you swearing at the TV. Interview 2. Miranda Tots, former director of the Palm Beach Treasure Cove region of the American Red Cross. Hurricane Sadie was the first hurricane to hit Daytona Beach area since 1960. Let me get that out of the way up front. Most hurricanes are going to make landfall around Miami or Key West, and when you have limited resources, that's where you're going to concentrate your prevention efforts. That's where you set up shop. Up until last fall, there seemed to be little to no point of putting manpower and resources into the Daytona Beach area. This was the major issue with the response. When you're guarding your head, you don't expect a blow to the breadbasket. The other issue was that no one, not in their wildest dreams, expected a storm anything like Hurricane Sadie. The laws of how hurricanes are supposed to behave seemed to no longer apply. The basic protocols for even the most severe hurricane is to evacuate everyone within 10 miles of the coast where the storm is going to make landfall. That's the worst case scenario any human being has ever seen. You get everyone 10 miles away from the coast, then you just have 150-mile-per-hour winds to deal with. But when they were tracking the storm, immediately things started to look wonky. Wonky was the term they used around the office. Everything was happening faster than normal. Developments off the coast that should have taken a day took 9 hours, and before we knew what was happening, the storm was strengthened. It just kept getting stronger as we watched. We'd never seen anything like it. And by the time we realized that it was going to happen, it was too late to reposition resources. All we could do was warn people and try to get as much information out to the public as possible. What did it feel like? I asked one of those forecasters that know about it. I'm not going to give you his name, but I asked him something like, "How did we not see this coming?" And he told me that feeling must have been similar to what the CIA felt, responsible for keeping tabs on bin Laden on 9/11. He saw it as a combination of intense regret that he had come for what he had done to figure out, and dread because at that point he knew it was coming, and we knew it was coming too, and late to properly prepare it was never going to work. We were sitting there before the storm was even visible from the coast, and we knew this was going to be one of the worst disasters we'd ever seen. We knew the storm would kill people, and because of my job, I knew the aftermath was probably going to kill more people than the storm, and I was right. But like I was saying, 10 miles. That was the protocol. Turns out with waves and infrastructure not up to the task, and the way the storm was pounding Florida so far north, 10 miles wasn't even close to adequate. Buildings 15 miles away were blown apart. You could only watch the amount of rain went up and up and up, 10 inches, 20, 50 inches. I can tell you now, at the height of the thing, I was on the phone with the Navy, and I told them, only half joking, they might be able to find boating lines all the way to Orlando. I could go on, but I don't like reliving it, to be honest. Besides, you're interested in Daytona Beach and FantasticLand, right? Okay, let me start with the hurricane, because some people don't understand what caused the conditions in the first place. Hurricanes are rated on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the most severe. A level 5 hurricane hits you with 150 to 180 miles per hour winds if you were in the path. With Sadie, we saw winds that high 75 miles inland. That's rare. What 150 mile per hour winds do, effectively, is blow small buildings off their foundations and rip the roofs off large buildings. You would expect to see a ton of roof damage for a storm like this, and what we were seeing was less roof damage and more roof removal. If someone was out in something like that, they would certainly be lifted off their feet and thrown away into the nearest solid object. If you hadn't taken shelter, you have certainly been injured or killed, and we saw our fair share of that. Anyone who had to respond to a hurricane will tell you, you will know, and you absolutely will know, the worst moment isn't huddling in a bathtub hoping your siding isn't in Louisiana. It's the moments after the storm dies, you walk outside and you realize you need help. Most Americans aren't too happy asking for help, to be honest with you. It's part of a national character. I used to run a Red Cross chapter in Iowa. We had to deal with tornadoes. You think it would be a straightforward idea. A tornado hits, some houses get damaged, you feed houses and provide resources to those affected. As it turns out, there's no point in opening shelters after a tornado. The folks who lost their homes, they're too proud to sleep in a gym or a church. They'll come in for a drink and a meal and cool off or warm up, but they'll never stay in the shelter. It's not part of the character there. I'm on a tangent. What was I talking to you about? Right. The moment. Right. The moment when you come out of your house, you're alive, but you realize your house isn't structurally sound and you have no electricity or water. There's something you can't do about it really immediately. The absence of self-determination is a terrifying prospect for most people. And then couple that with the lack of preparation many of those people have, it's a bad situation. Some of those affected by the storm were more than unprepared. They were dumbstruck. We saw that particularly in more affluent areas. Some of them had generators, but not one of them had thought about, water? I ran across more than one family who had a generator, but never turned it on. They didn't have the gas for it. Unprepared is an understatement, but I'm digressing again. In that moment, when you realize you need help, that's when we're supposed to fill in our main purpose, to be there to help. And we were ready to help in Miami and Key West. Even with 2 feet of water on the roads, we were fine there, but up north, we knew we were in trouble. That moment of silence after the storm was bad for everyone. But I think it was worse for me and my volunteers. We realized we were out of position and that hell might break loose before we got there. Some locations weren't nearly as bad as we were worried about. People were civil and helping each other. We got help first. It was the best of America. Then you go to the next location and it would be out and out looting and every man for himself. No, I don't want to talk about those 3 nursing homes that made the news. No. FantasticLand was an interesting case for a number of perspectives. We knew from dealing with the company going all the way back to the 1980s that they kept ample water, rations, medicine, and other survival gear in multiple locations around the park, as well as an internal communications system to communicate with their employees. The idea, as it was relayed to me, was that they could survive for a couple of days being cut off from all civilization within the park full of people. I was able to speak to some of their board members a couple of weeks after Sadie hit and was assured that they were staffed with something like 300 employees and that most of those employees would be able to stay alive for another month if they needed to. I know this point is now disputed, but I have conversations with the record, so I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know or already heard yourself. I was also assured that all the visitors had been transported inland and were dealing primarily with employees. At one point, the board members raised the issue of his visitors' luggage, which was way, way down the list of relevant topics. I don't want to make this sound like he didn't care about his employees. He clearly did from an administrative and personal standpoint, but in disasters, people react differently. It's not uncommon for people to focus on one thing they can control amid a sea of chaos and hyper-focus on one thing. If you ask my opinion, as someone who's worked in disaster preparedness response for 3 decades, I think he was scared and didn't know what to think that his employees would be in danger. Of course they were in danger. We all were. What this conversation with the representatives from Fantastic Land did right away was bump Fantastic Land way down the list of tiers of locations where you're going to need to tackle in order. When you have 5,000 locations in need of assistance, it only makes sense that Fantastic Land cede its place in line to more immediate concerns, and trust me, we had more immediate concerns. We had 1 million people homeless. We had 10 million people without power. We had rescue efforts and aid distributions and truckloads of unwanted aid to deal with. Volunteers flooded in faster with assigned their duties. Fantastic Land had water, food, relative safety for 300 employees. We knew they were there. We just need to go get them. It was going to take some time. The other aspect of Fantastic Land that made it an interesting case was the way the park was set up. It's one huge, several thousand acre park divided into sections, but topographically, it's on a decent piece of land that is far from flooding, and that's not the concern. It wasn't going to flood easily, is what I mean. Also, Mr. Trex, I believe his name was, had built detention cells around a few areas, and the thinking being that they would either prevent the flooding altogether or lessen the effect, which they certainly did. That was another reason we put Fantastic Land behind the other locations, where people were drowning fighting over resources. What we didn't account for, and what nobody could have accounted for, was that the rain kept coming. After Sadie finally blew herself out, we couldn't catch a break for weeks. September is the wet season in that part of the state anyways. Well, one of the wet seasons, but that year was beyond what we expected. Some locations in Daytona received up to 24 inches of rain in 3 weeks after Sadie, which had a very negative effect on rescue efforts. We don't deny that a lot of people died. When you have only so many boots on the ground and only so much air support and more places to evacuate than you ever had in the history of your organization, and you get 2 feet of rain on top of that, everything is not going to plan. You must understand, about the world of disaster response, you must understand just one thing, really. You do the most good you can, fully understanding you aren't going to get everyone quickly, and that because of a disaster like this, people are going to die. Now that I'm no longer leadership role within the Red Cross, I can also point out the consolidations led to less volunteer training and fewer hands to work, which, with my particular case, but to be fair, we wouldn't have had enough hands if we had suddenly found ourselves at double our funding levels. It was a massive, massive undertaking, and we started from behind. Then, like any disaster, managing the people who want to help becomes a big job. We had busloads of Boy Scouts on mission groups show up every day, and we had to tell them, it's not safe here, turn around. We were going to go through neighborhood by neighborhood, and some of them were completely inappropriate environments for volunteers. I remember one day a semi-truck full of stuffed animals showed up. Everyone had a million things to do, and all of a sudden we had 10,000 stuffed animals to deal with. The families who could maybe use them had no place to put them. Everyone wants to help, but oh man, when a truck full of stuffed animals shows up, I was about ready to kill someone. We ended up dumping them in the detention cell and commandeering the truck to ship supplies. I remember shots of thousands of stuffed animals floating in filthy water showing up on the news. I'm sorry, I keep veering from the subject. We first approached Fantastic Land on September 29th from the air. We had surveillance planes in the sky after the storm broke, and again, Fantastic Land was an interesting case. We could see the front had flooded. We could see the swamp-like conditions all the way around the park, but we could see almost see that the park was dry. There was no obvious sign of distress from survivors that we could see. All the buildings seemed structurally intact. There were no bed sheets with help us messages hanging out windows like in most of the other communities. That was an uncommon point of relief in the effort. When we flew over on the 29th, we did not see the yardarm, and the bodies hanging had received no outward cries for help, so we bumped Fantastic Land down the priorities again. It's quite simple. When you have places screaming for help, and news helicopters flying over to get hours and hours and hours of footage of the job you're not doing, it becomes very easy to let lower priorities slide down the list. We stopped flying by FantasticLand, and with the help of their management, we made plans to get them after we had taken care of the businesses in several nearby townships. The risk was that the things could degenerate, but I hate sounding callous, we simply did not have the resources to worry about that. If things were going to go bad in Fantasticland, and they obviously did, we were not in any position to provide aid. When the large exclamation point at the center of the park fell, I was alerted to it, and it did seem strange. I passed the information along to the command center and urged someone in the office to contact Fantasticland again, see if they had any information we didn't have. We never heard back. By that point, Fantasticland had its own internal problems, and it was hard to figure out who was in charge. Yes, the fact that nobody could tell us who was in charge at the moment meant that Fantasticland was left to sit. And that's probably part of the reason it wasn't breached until October 20th, with the National Guard going in guns drawn, as they had every right to do. Then the media showed up, and heads started to roll. I'm sorry, that pun was in terrible taste. I wish I hadn't said it. Yes, Mr. Fresno was as helpful as he could be. Mainly, he was in shock. I will not comment on what happened inside the park. I don't know what went on there, and I don't want to know. I had spent 35 days before this Fantasticland situation dealing with one of the worst natural disasters mankind has ever had to deal with, using tools that were invented on the spot because nobody thought of anything like this was possible. I understand why you're focusing on this, Mr. Jakes. It's sensational, it's amazing, and it speaks to the human capacity for evil. I would just beg you, after you're done with this glitzy story, go out and talk to people who survived Sadie. You'll find just the opposite of what you'll find here. You'll find so many stories of people who worked and worked to help their fellow man until they literally collapsed. People who went without a drink for days to give their water to dying babies. You will find heroism and horror in equal measure that will put this story well-off kids killing each other to shame, sir. You will find stories like you wouldn't believe. I have enough stories to last a lifetime. Interview 3. Aaron Hoffman, husband of Suzanne, father of Kendall Kean, evacuated from Fantasticland as Hurricane Sadie hit. And unfortunately, the hitting of said hurricane is where we're going to stop today. I know, I'm terrible. But if you want something more terrible, I don't mean quality of the book. It's a great book if you give it a chance to read. Just what happens. The trigger warnings I would give you is basically yes. But if you're willing to read all that, Fantasticland is not in physical form in our library because this is my personal copy. Where you can find it, however, is on our Hoopla service. You don't even have to leave your house. So if, say, flooding of biblical proportions were to occur over a week and you're stuck with the internet and nothing really to read, I'd give Mike Bockoven's book, Fantasticland, a shot. It's I'm not going to say nice way to spend a week, but it's certainly an interesting read. Lord of the Flies at Disneyland? Who's not going to take an appeal of that? Anywho, I hope your summer vacation plans go a lot better than what happened at Fantasticland. This has been Word of Mouth for May 2026. Thank you, good night, good luck, and we have a lot more stories to tell you coming up.